Hey guys, welcome back to your channel. As the pandemic continues to progress, we're starting to see the light at the end of this long, dark tunnel. And a lot of people are starting to consider international travel and long-haul travel. So today I want to bring you top 10 tips, tricks, and especially warnings for booking flights during the pandemic. And this also applies to any other uncertain situation as well as destination. Let's begin. The first rule is also the most important one. It is to buy your tickets as late as possible. In normal times, I would highly advise you against this because the airlines will always jack up the prices of their last-minute flights by 2 times or sometimes 10 times. But in the current situation, there's really no way for you to predict if a country is gonna open up or close, as their policies can change within the span of 1 day. And the worst thing you can do is to give the airlines an interest-free loan, or even worse, they don't cancel your flight, you are gonna lose out on all the money you have. And not to mention, the old world no longer exists. The last-minute flights nowadays are not as expensive as they previously have been. So the point of avoiding buying last-minute tickets has mostly become moot. So you have to hold on to your cash for as long as possible and only make the booking once you are 100% certain that you can make the trip. The second point is rather obvious but often overlooked. It is simply to book more flexible tickets. I know, in normal times I would highly advise you against this. As you can see right here in my travel hacking playlist, I have always advocated for you to build your flexibility into the travel hacking method instead of into the tickets themselves. But now with just a policy change, you can suddenly be subjected to 21 days of mandatory quarantine just because you transited in the wrong country. You really have no other choice other than making your tickets as flexible as possible. And once I introduce you to the next few points, you're gonna understand that this is gonna be very useful. The third tip is to know the country's immigration policies. It is your responsibility, not the airlines, to verify that if you're eligible to enter a country or not. And you need to be especially careful when you're conducting research in this matter because I've seen a lot of media articles simply twisting the facts just to get more clicks. For example, a few weeks ago, I saw a few articles claiming that Europe will be opening up for vaccinated visitors without any quarantine requirement this summer. This is simply untrue in the ways that you are thinking, because Europe has always been open to any visitor as long as they are on essential traveling purposes. So they are simply removing the 14-day quarantine requirements for those traveling on essential traveling business and are vaccinated. So that means that you cannot simply waltz into Europe for tourism regardless if you are vaccinated or not this summer. Well, because I take way too long to edit these videos as I'm doing post-production, it is announced that EU will accept vaccinated US tourists this summer. But it still shows my point. Policies can change within the span of a few days, and the media reports are not usually very correct. And this also applies for your transiting country as well. For example, China is now completely closed to any foreign nationals. That means you cannot even transit there. So if you see a cheap ticket on China Southern to Bangkok in November, you need to be very careful, because if by late November Thailand is open but China is not, then your ticket is going to be useless because you still cannot transit in China, while you can probably transit in Hong Kong or Taipei or Japan. So you need to be very careful on that front as well. One of the most reliable tools to check for these regulations is the COVID-19 Travel Regulations Map by IATA. It is the organization that is responsible for controlling most of the international flights. All the airlines rely on this information when checking you in for a flight, and they are almost always very up to date with the newest regulations. And next up reasonably is to figure out the airline's policies regarding changes as well as cancellations. Bear with me here, it's gonna get a little bit technical, but it's all gonna be worth it at the end, okay? Trust me. So for the airlines, in their eyes, there are only 2 kinds of changes and cancellations. One is called voluntary and one is called involuntary. The main difference is basically if the airline has made a significant alteration to your itinerary or not. And just to give you an example, a voluntary change or cancellation can simply be due to you don't want to go anymore, or you are sick, or something as unfair as a government policy change. Just hypothetically, such as the Japanese government today suddenly comes out and says, starting today, no foreign national is allowed to enter our country for whatsoever reason. And you have your flight tomorrow, Well, as long as the airline does not cancel your flight tomorrow, you are considered a voluntary change or cancellation, because it is you as a passenger's responsibility to determine if you can legally enter the country or not. And on the other hand, involuntary changes and cancellation mostly fall under two categories. One is outright cancellation of your flight. This one is easy to understand. And the other one is a significant schedule change. And what is a significant schedule change? Well, any schedule change that can cause you to miss your flight is considered significant, of course. But the other one is really up to the interpretation of the airline or the company, right? So for a lot of airlines, they will say anything above 2 hours of schedule change will be considered significant in their eyes. But for some others, they will say 4. But for an airline as unfair and evil as United, they will simply just say anything above 25 hours is considered significant in the pandemic. So you really need to be careful when you're selecting your airline. So how do the airlines deal with these two kinds of changes and cancellations? Well, for the involuntary ones, the governments require the airlines to provide you with at least these two options. The first one is a full refund with no question asked. And the second one is a schedule change in a reasonable time frame for absolutely free. And do keep in mind that these options bypass any original restriction you have on the ticket. So even if you have bought the most basic economy ticket out there, you can still have these two options as long as you fall underneath the involuntary category. As for the voluntary ones, it is mostly dependent on your original ticket. So if you have bought a more flexible ticket, you can of course follow the rules and make changes and cancellations. But if you bought a basic economy ticket, then you're mostly out of luck. You basically have to give up your money to the airline overlords. So now we know how airlines deal with changes and cancellations in normal times. We just need to know most of them base their coronavirus policies as an expansion of their normal one. So for example, if you have your flight canceled today, you can move it to the end of this year or even next year for free. But do keep in mind that this kind of expansion can also work against you. Such as Air Canada, they simply remove the option for you to get your refund if you have your flights cancelled. But you're gonna ask, wait, isn't this illegal as the government requires them to give you a full refund as an option? Well, technically yes, but their official response is just like, yeah, but what are you gonna do, huh? Seriously, you're gonna sue us, a multi-billion-dollar company? Yeah, good luck with that. So yes, be extra vigilant and keep yourself informed when you're choosing an airline, especially about their coronavirus policies. Next up, I want to talk about changes a little bit more because the airlines have made it especially complicated in order to deter you from changing your ticket. And I'm here to help you with that. And the first thing I want to talk about is regarding involuntary changes. A lot of these airlines will actually force you to rebook into the same fare class as your original booking. And I don't mean the class of service such as economy or business class. Just within economy class, there's over a dozen fare classes, and you have to book in the same one. It ranges from basic economy all the way to normal economy, all the way up to fully flexible economy. So if you want to change your basic economy ticket into a new flight, that new flight needs to have a basic economy ticket for sale. Otherwise, it will not be available. As for voluntary changes, there's this one thing that I actually forgot to mention. All of the free changes I mentioned before for voluntary changes are actually not free. What the airlines advertise as a free change when you're booking your ticket is actually a waive of your change fees. So your procedure of changing the flights will be free, but the actual cost may vary. Because if you bought a cheap flight on sale, incentivized by their advertisement, and you need to change it later, you usually have to pay a fair difference if the new ticket is more expensive than your old one. So for example, you bought a $50 ticket on sale and now the ticket is $150 in your new desired date. You have to pay $100 to make up for it. So be extra cautious when you're booking tickets and you know that you want to change it. This is for the folks who really like to enjoy luxury. I would advise you against booking business class and first class seats during the pandemic. This is because a lot of the airlines have drastically cut costs in higher cabins of service. Back in the days, you might be able to sip a few cups of champagne while enjoying your 7-course meal. Now you will be lucky if you can get a cold cut sandwich instead of a granola bar in first class. And on the other hand, a lot of the flight attendants are actively discouraged from interacting with the customers, so you're gonna get much less service. And as a result, I really don't think it's worth 10 times or even 20 times more money to buy a business class or a first class ticket, unless you really need that bigger seat. I would also advise you not to use a travel agent. And I don't mean just those brick and mortar ones you see on the streets, but also online travel agents, shortened to OTA. You might be familiar with some of them, such as Kayak or Expedia or Cheapo Air. Whenever you buy a ticket through them, you are actually not buying a ticket on the airline. The OTAs are buying the ticket on the airline, and they are simply slapping your name on the flight. So whenever the airline needs to notify you or warn you of a cancellation or a change, you cannot actually be contacted directly. They actually have to go through the OTA, which will in turn come and inform you. And the same goes backwards as well. If you want to cancel your flight or change your flight, you cannot go to the airline directly. You have to call or email the OTA, which will in turn go through their internal channels to inform the airline. So you can see you're adding an unnecessary middleman in the middle of all of your communications. And some of these OTAs can be quite small despite their large international presence online. And some of them can only have one or two offices, and in the current situations, they might be inundated with tens or even hundreds of thousands of different requests for changes and cancellations. So they might be very overwhelmed. And a lot of these smaller OTAs actually have timelines sometimes ranging from weeks to even months to get back to you. So your communication is extremely inefficient when you are coming to this kind of time-sensitive matter. And this leads me to my next point, which is to avoid those vulnerable entities. And the first thing that may come into your mind is, of course, to avoid those vulnerable airlines. That is very true, because the aviation industry has been hit especially hard since the beginning of the pandemic. And a lot of the airlines, even some of the major ones, are now struggling to stay alive. So I would personally recommend you not to book with an airline such as Norwegian, because they have never been able to make a profit since its establishment, and now they have filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They are going through a very radical structural change, and it is really up for anyone's guess that if they will be able to survive this winter or perhaps the next one. So if you need to book a ticket on Norwegian, just keep in mind that if they go bankrupt again, you are not going to end up with anything. And the second is to avoid vulnerable OTAs. A lot of these online travel agents may seem really big online, but they're actually really small in real life. So some of them may only have a couple $100,000 in cash. And if they are hit with a wave of cancellations and refunds, they are basically doomed. Right? So if you have a ticket with them, you should be fine as long as the airline doesn't make any drastic changes. But if you need to make any cancellations or a change, then you are doomed as well. And lastly, I want to tell you that you need to avoid those vulnerable destinations. And I don't mean those places that can easily get you the bad soup virus. No. I mean those places that are prone to very drastic changes. A good example of this is actually China. They have enacted a list of sweeping bans overnight, and suddenly a lot of people's changes as well as flights are completely destroyed. And another place like this is Australia. They have this policy of like a meltdown protocol for each state. So if a state has over a few dozen infections overnight, and suddenly the entire state goes into lockdown, and there's no way that you can enter or exit without a special permit. So I would personally recommend you to avoid places like China or Australia in the near future. And it is always good to double check, because there are a lot of airlines who simply do not follow their own published policies, or there are some that have hidden protocols. One of such good resources is on Flyertalk, where you can find a forum dedicated to coronavirus travel. And if you want even more information about a specific airline, you can always go into the miles and points section, where there is a separate forum for almost every single major airline. And in these forums, you can always find the most dedicated and knowledgeable flyers of that airline. And another good resource is to simply conduct a Google search and go onto one of the hundreds of travel blogs out there. A good place to start might be Boarding Area. All of these bloggers are extremely knowledgeable, and some of them have direct ties with the airline industry, so their information is almost always very up to date. And lastly, I want to introduce you to some of these riskier maneuvers that you can possibly imagine to attempt. Because in times of crisis like this, it is also times of opportunity. So first, a legal disclaimer, of course. I am not responsible for any financial loss incurred in any of these maneuvers, because this is like gambling, but even worse. Okay? I will begin with the least risky one. A lot of the airlines are now offering you the opportunity to convert the voucher into their points for a small bonus. It ranges all the way from 10% to 50%. And you're basically just converting a low liquidity airline cash into another form of low liquidity airline cash. So if you know how to spend your points, why don't you take the 50% bonus, right? And the second one is much riskier. It is to simply book a connection or a flight that can put you into the involuntary situation. And how would you do that? Well, simply just book a flight into a country that you know almost for sure will not be able to open up by the time you fly. Let's just say you book a flight into China in late July. Yeah, we all know it is 99% certain that China will not open up to foreigners by late July. So if you book your flights in late July and it got cancelled when it's 40 days to 60 days in advance, when the airlines finally roll in the changes, you can kick the can down the road to maybe next February when the ticket is much more expensive. And the same thing can happen if you have a really tight or weird connection. So if the airline make any changes that causes you to miss your connection, you can also fall into the involuntary change and cancellation type, and you can kick it all the way down to the end of the year or perhaps next year. And the third one is also the riskiest, and I do not recommend you to try it for yourself because I heard the success rate is really low. A lot of Middle Eastern airlines have really generous rebooking policies. For example, Emirates allows you to change your origin or destination within the same continent if your original flight was cancelled. I have seen some maniacs booked a first-class ticket on the Emirates tag-on flight from Phnom Penh to Bangkok. They correctly predicted that the airline would cancel this 90-minute flight, and thus they become eligible to change it into any flight within Asia. And some of them managed to convince the airline to change them into something like a Tokyo to Dubai to Bangkok, and turn this $300 90-minute first-class experience into a 20+ hours of first-class experience. And similar things happened on Qatar as well. You can change your flight into any destination within 5,000 miles. Which is basically half of the entire globe. And it is not hard to imagine that a lot of people managed to take advantage of this policy. Well, that's all I got for you today regarding booking flights during the pandemic. And if you really like the tips, tricks, and especially the hacks I have introduced in this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up because it really helps me out. And if you want to see more videos like this one, consider clicking the red subscribe button beneath me. Please travel safe, and I'll see you around.